Welcome to the Water Shelf Podcast, where we dive into the wonderful world of water books. The Water Shelf is a production of Maven's Notebook, California's Water News Central. My name is Justin Scott-Coe, water manager, pirate, and book aficionado. More information on the Water Shelf and Maven's Notebook will be provided at the end of this episode. It is my great pleasure to welcome Buzz Thompson to the Water Shelf Podcast. Professor Thompson is the Robert E. Paradise Professor of Natural Resources Law at the Stanford Law School. He is also the founding Perry L. McCarty Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, where he remains a senior fellow and directs the Water in the West program, and is a professor of environmental behavioral sciences in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Professor Thompson is a practicing attorney specializing in water resources, was a former law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist, and was appointed by the Supreme Court as a special master to resolve an interstate water dispute. Among his many other accolades and accomplishments, Professor Thompson has authored or co-authored numerous books on environmental law and policy, and is most recently the author of Liquid Asset: How Business and Government Can Partner to Solve the Freshwater Crisis, published by Stanford University Press earlier this year. Buzz, I am thrilled to speak with you about your exciting new book. Thank you for coming on the Water Podcast.
Thank you, Justin. It's my pleasure to be on the podcast, and I look forward to the next half hour or so with you.
I look forward to it too, and I got to ask my first question. I loved with all your accolades, seeing that you go by Buzz Thompson, and I was just wondering if there was a story behind your nom de guerre, so to speak.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a story behind it. I was named Buzz nicknamed Buzz by my sister when I was less than a year old. I and my father had the same first name, and she decided she needed to come up with a name specifically for me. And this was the early days of television, and there was a program on the air at that point called Space Patrol. And the hero of Space Patrol was Buzz Corey. It was Buzz Corey and the Space Cadets. And she was about 10 years older than I was. And so she decided that she had a crush on Buzz Corey, and so I would become Buzz too. So I've always thought that meant that I think I'm related to Buzz Lightyear.
That's right.
I think Buzz Lightyear was named after Buzz Corey. So anyway, yeah, so there's a name, and I've tried other names over time, and of course, people have always tried other names on me, but Buzz is the one that stuck.
That's fantastic. What a wonderful story. Well, I am very excited. I was very excited to read your book because it's similarly, although it didn't take me all the way back to my childhood, it did take me back to the beginning of my water career in the water field, where I worked in the private sector. And I've since worked very closely with many engineering, finance, technology, and legal professionals in the private sector who provides just such a tremendous service to the public water agencies like the one that I manage. So this book really meant a great deal to me, from a career standpoint, as well as to better understand the full expanse of the water sector, inclusive of both private and public entities and agencies. My first question, though, before we get into the content of the book, is how you came about to writing this wonderful book. What inspired you to write Liquid Asset? And also, who do you consider its intended audience, or who do you most want to read this book?
Two really interesting questions. So in some ways, I'm the last person that you would think would write this book, because I'm a lawyer. That's my background. That's my primary area of expertise. And so that has meant for years what I focused on are water laws and water policies. But as I became increasingly frustrated over the rate of change that takes place in water law and frequently in water policy, I started looking around, and I realized that the private sector actually was moving very quickly in developing new technologies, in developing water markets, And so that led me to take a deep dive into the private water sector. And as you just pointed out, the private sector is involved in multiple ways already in water policy and water management. And no one has really taken a step back and told the entire picture. So that was my goal, to really give a comprehensive but hopefully interesting portrait of the private sector and to talk about how it is involved today, what it could be doing to help us in solving water issues, and then going back to my primary career, talking about what types of laws and policies are necessary in order to maximize the advantage of the private sector while making sure, of course, that we still protect the public interest in water resources.
Well, and that is such an incredible scope for a book, and I want to get into some of the answers to those posed questions that you posed to yourself in generating the book. But one more preliminary question is, I'm just curious, was there a particular book inspired you to write Liquid Asset, or inspired you while you were writing Liquid Asset?
Again, a great question. So, to some degree, I was inspired by the fact that there wasn't a book on my bookshelf that told the story of the private sector, at least told it comprehensively and told it in a way which I thought was fair-handed. And I frequently write books because I've gone to my bookshelf, gone to the library, looking for something that I want to read, and found that it doesn't exist. And so that was the primary motivation. Having said that, though, there have been a variety of books published over the last 15 years or so, which has criticized what the authors frequently call the commodification of water. Most of the time, those books are focused on the private supplying of water in developing countries. And so to the degree there were books out there about the private sector, they were all negative. They were all saying, we have to really worry about this, and this is a real problem. And so another motive behind this book was, again, to say, hey, yeah, there's privatization of water, and we have to be careful about privatization of water. I actually think private water companies can frequently bring a lot of resources to water provision, but there are challenges and problems there. But that's just one aspect of the private sector. And if you take this broader perspective, then you see all of the advantages that the private sector can bring to water management. So again, this book's partly written because there was a gap, and it's partly written to try to show that, in fact, the private sector is not that sort of evil entity out there that a lot of the anti-commodification books suggest.
Very true. And one of the things I enjoyed so much about it was it really spoke to the actual and practical nature of what I called in my review of the book, the actual water sector is already a private-public partnership. Going into the book itself, the book, provides that incredible wealth of information and knowledge about the private sector and its relationship with the public sector. But it also has a point of view. It has a thesis. And I was wondering if you could summarize how you see what the thesis or the central argument of Liquid Asset.
Yeah. So first of all, I should just say that the major challenge I had in writing the book is it is a comprehensive sector, and there's so many different rabbit holes you could go down if you were really interested in understanding all of the various details. So hopefully I've done a fairly good job in summarizing things while keeping the book at an interesting level. But you're also right in your question in that I think I probably do have a fairly defined perspective on the private sector of water. And so the major perspective, major message I have about the private sector is that it can play an extremely valuable role. And one of the things that it can add to the public sector, as you point out, inevitably, this has to be a private-public partnership, right? Private sector is not going to come in here and solve the day without the public sector. They need each other. But in that partnership, the private sector can often bring additional innovation. And I say additional innovation because the public sector is already innovative. I hope the book does not get interpreted as a slight or a slam on the public sector. You work in the public sector, and my guess is you are solving problems on a daily basis, and you're having to be very creative frequently in how you do it. But I think the private sector brings that additional level of innovation for several reasons. First of all, a lot of the companies that are involved in the water sector are also involved in other sectors. And so they can bring lessons that they see, maybe it's in the renewable energy field, or maybe it's a new type of technology involved in other utilities. They can bring those sort of lessons to the partnership. So I think that's one of the reasons why you have that additional innovation. Also, in addition to that, the private sector has to be innovative in order to be successful. When you're out there looking for consultants, for example, to bring in, you want consultants who are really, really knowledgeable, but you're looking for that innovation. You're looking for the person who's more creative in helping you solve various issues. And so they have a very specific incentive to bring innovation into the sector. So I think for those two reasons, the private sector is frequently very innovative, and as I say, brings that additional innovation to looking at various problems.
So true. When you were saying that, I was thinking about my experience when I briefly left the water district and started working my local city's utility department, which had both energy and it has both energy and water. There was actually an initiative at that time to try to train managers in private sector areas of growth and leadership. And I received trainings on design thinking, for instance, which is this area of innovation in the private sector that, help create, the mouse on the computer and things like that to try to create these ideas. And there was a real interest in improving our approach to not so much managing projects, but managing the product itself, the energy service, the water service as a product in and of itself, similar to the private sector. And I know that there's been a lot of interest in, say, customer service from the private sector, learning from the private sector how we can improve on customer service, especially the retail agencies like mine, which will provide that service to customers, even though they don't have the choice of different water providers. So everything you're saying really, resounds. You cover a large number of private water sectors in the book, and I just quickly looking at them, and they're nicely tabulated in your table 2.1 that I mentioned in the review. You have the technology sector, the water market sector, large water consumers in the private sector, water suppliers, as you mentioned, engineering consulting firms, infrastructure and finance, social enterprise impact funds, nonprofit organizations and foundations. I mean, it's just a rich and very diverse range of different types of private organizations that interact with the public agencies and management agencies in the sector. I was curious, one area that I'd like to hear from you about that wasn't on that list, or maybe could be included in, say, consulting firms, is law firms. You are a practicing attorney. Law firms, I think, are all private entities typically, or generally. And I was wondering if, and I kind of, tongue in cheek in my review said, well, you've already kind of written the book on that. You've written a lot of books about the legal aspects of water resource and environmental resource management. But I was wondering what you think about the legal profession and its interaction with public water providers and management agencies.
Yeah, so I've thought about whether or not I should add a section on lawyers and legal practice to the book, and ultimately decided that I was probably too close to it. But my perspective is, and this is something that I frequently tell my students, there are two types of lawyers, and both of them stem from the way in which we teach law school. One type of lawyer is the problem identifier. Because when we teach law school classes, one of the things that we are constantly teaching our students is, okay, you have to be able to look at a situation and identify all of the potential challenges that you have to solve. And so the problem identifier lawyer is the lawyer who, for example, if you called a lawyer and would come in and say, okay, well, you're thinking about doing X, and I'll tell you right now that there are 10 problems with what you're planning on doing. And the other type of lawyer, on the other hand, is who I consider to be the problem solver. That's the person who comes in and says, what do you want to do? And you tell them what you want to do, and they say, well, okay, well, this is the way we're going to go about doing it. If you do it this way, you can be successful in that. And that's because we also teach law school students how to be interdisciplinary problem solvers, how to take a problem, identify all the various issues, and then try to solve them. And unfortunately, I think in the world there may be more problem identifiers than there are problem solvers. I tell my students, when you get out there, you need to be the problem solver. But I think there are a lot of problem identifiers out there. And of course, what that does is it makes it all the more challenging for us to solve all the various water crises that we face. Because everybody who has a lawyer, that lawyer is telling them, oh, you don't want to do that. That's really dangerous. Or you don't want to do that because actually, your water right doesn't require you to do that. And as a result, we just sort of stayed planted in place. Whereas the more creative attorneys are the ones that come up with new solutions, new ideas. And getting back to the book again, maybe a subtext of the book is the importance of creativity, the importance of innovation, the importance of new ideas. And I wish the legal profession did that even more than it does. And again, there are lawyers in both categories, but I wish there were more problem solvers, creative lawyers than there are those that tell you what you have to worry about.
That is going to be a distinction I'm going to be thinking a lot about going forward out of this interview. And it's fascinating. I can think of lawyers that we've worked with that are in both categories. And that's a fascinating way of thinking about it. Kind of translating that over into the public sector. I mean, that you're kind of identifying a way for one area in the private sector to provide a greater level of assistance to the public sector. You also identify an innovation deficit in the public sector, and due primarily to our fragmentation. There's just a whole bunch of different water agencies out there at all different levels of water management or provision, and then also the conservative nature of the water industry, which I think you mean not so much politically conservative, but more of typically doing things the way we've done them along the past. And water is a heavy element; it hasn't changed much, and so it's difficult to bring too much innovation. But innovation does need to be had, since we do have the freshwater crisis that you mentioned in your book's subtitle. So I was wondering if you could, you provide so many different ways in which the public sector can overcome this innovation deficit or close the deficit in partnership with the private sector colleagues. I was wondering if you could identify maybe a couple of your favorites, ways in which the public sector can close this innovation deficit.
The first thing I should note is something that I and a lot of my engineering friends frequently point out, is that water, unfortunately, is a field in which we are trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century technology and 19th century laws and policies. And that is not a good way of trying to solve the crises that we face. So I got very interested in this question of water innovation when I hosted a conference with the Brookings Institute about a decade ago. And we were looking for topics, and I said, one thing that there isn't a lot of literature on yet is technological innovation in the water field. There are a lot of people who've written about this in the energy area, but virtually no one in the water field. And so I said, why don't we take a look at that? And so at that point, I tried in multiple ways to see whether or not we had the right level of innovation, technological innovation in the water field. That's a hard question to answer, because how do you measure innovation and what's the right amount of innovation? So one of the things that we did, though, that I thought was meaningful was that we looked at how many new patents were coming out in water versus how many new patents were coming out in the energy field. And one of the things we found was that there were far fewer water patents than energy patents, but more importantly, about 2006, 2007, the number of patents in the energy field took off, whereas the water field sort of just flatlined. And if you also then look at other ways in which you might be able to measure innovation, you see actually a very similar pattern. So that we've, as a nation, always put more money into new energy technologies, for example, solar or wind energy, than we have put into developing new water technologies, less expensive recycling or less expensive desalination. And again, in sort of the mid-2000s, the amount of money we were putting into the energy sector rose significantly, but not in the water sector. So that led me and a number of colleagues I was working with to say, hey, we are facing a water innovation deficit. And various articles I've read by other people since then have all seemed to confirm that not only in the United States, but frequently in other countries, we are facing this water innovation deficit. So then the question becomes, how do you solve that particular issue? And for me, there are multiple aspects of that. One is we do need to invest more money into new water technology in the same way that that we do with other fields such as energy. That money that goes into the support of new technological innovation in water, it could come from the federal government. I always point out to people, we have a Department of Energy, we don't have a Department of Water, even though water is just as important, not more important than energy. But it will probably also have to come from water suppliers. And there's lies the rub, because I'm sure that you, as the manager of a major water supplier, are constantly having your customers say, hey, water is too expensive. Why are you planning on raising the rates next year? But that simply means you have less money to invest in innovation, because you're having to keep rates as low as possible, and you have to keep that water flowing to your customers on a daily basis. So those would be, that the money is maybe the best place to start. That there are a lot of other things, but that would be my first point.
Boy, that is so true. You are speaking my language, sir, and that is the challenge, is trying to build that in. And you even identified the different categories of technological innovation, and it's the seventh chapter of the book, the demand side innovations, conservation, supply side innovations, how to develop additional water resources through advanced treatment, and so on. Water quality innovations, addressing our water quality challenges to ensure that people feel fully confident in drinking their tap water. New data and information systems, and in that last one, there's an interesting example in California that I'm sure you're probably familiar with. You might be involved in. I know that the California Data Collaborative was formed in order to create a collaborative approach to draw in funding, hopefully, but also to do it so that it's not just individual water agencies, but they can all work together on doing that. And I think it was initiated in a partnership between water agencies, but also with connections in the high tech field with folks from Netflix and places like that, to try to pull in some of that innovation that you were talking about into the water sector, at least from a data management standpoint. It's an interesting model for for addressing that challenge. There's another area of your book that I thought was absolutely fascinating, maybe because I'm not very familiar in this area, and that is where you talk about some of the private sector change agents, as you call them, the foundations, the nonprofits, some of those broader viewed consultant firms that are having a growing positive influence on water management, and really trying to get in there and work with public water managers to address some of these challenges. I was wondering if you could discuss that area that I found very interesting, but as well as you very even-handedly do throughout the book, the potential risks or threats of over-influence, of becoming a consultocracy, which I love the term in your book, and how we can maybe go too far in working with those change agents.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fascinating dilemma, because we do have these change agents who are having a significant influence. I think generally positive, but a significant influence on water management. So you brought up, for example, a moment ago, the California Water Data Collaborative, which is critically important. We cannot manage water without the data to manage it. We have all of these new companies like Google, for example, that can provide data in a way which was not possible a decade ago. That's largely the result of foundations who identified that as a problem and made the effort of holding some workshops to point out the importance of new data and getting that collaborative going. And foundations are playing a larger and larger role in the water sector, trying to find ways in which they, through philanthropic dollars, can help promote better water management. At the same time, you also have a variety of nonprofits out there that are working to change water policy. They might be an environmental nonprofit like the Environmental Defense Fund. They might be a nonprofit focused on the right to water and ensuring that everyone in the state has an adequate and affordable source of drinking water. They're out there trying to change the way in which we do things. An example there is with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California. As you know, the state let local governments originally come up with groundwater sustainability plans. Well, those environmental nonprofits were evaluating every single plan and then writing letters to the state and to the local agency, telling them what they thought of those plans and where the deficiencies were in those plans. And then finally, you have the consultants, which, as you pointed out, public agencies have worked with consulting firms for years. But those consulting firms are both the source of information and frequently an intermediary between the regulator and the public agency. So you have this really sort of vast private sector that's involved. They're not the ones that, if even in the water field, go up to somebody and say, well, who are private water entities? They generally don't immediately think about foundations or nonprofit organizations. And so they operate a little bit submerged, right? They're not quite as obvious. And foundations and nonprofits, where do they get their instructions on what to do? Well, it's basically the employees and the board, right? There's no external entity telling them what policies to follow. They're following their own internal guidance. So I think it's a really fascinating field that hasn't gotten very much attention.
Absolutely agree. I mean, even at at the regional level, I think about, our adjudicated basin, and it involves a great deal, obviously, of attorneys, but also of engineering consultants and their work on our behalf directly with the regional water quality control board and working out some of the groundwater quality issues. And they play a vital role of being that intermediary and expert connector between the water providers or producers of groundwater and the regulators of that groundwater resource. And you just kind of broaden that over and over to the national and even international level. It's a tremendously important area. And you provide a really important overview. My last kind of content related question before pulling out and talking about the book again is I was wondering what you see the private sector doing in addressing its own water challenges, or those that at times that the private sector presents the challenges to the public sector, like, for instance, pollution. In our groundwater basin, we're dealing with a lot of legacy pollution from historical agriculture, for instance, and agriculture, of course, being private, inefficient or excessive water use, those types of things. And you talk about some examples of how, say, like Coca-Cola trying to address that through their net zero effort, but I was wondering if you could talk about how the private sector is doing in addressing the challenges they themselves present.
Yeah, no, that is, I think, perhaps the critical question at the moment, because if you're talking about the private sector, you need to start with a recognition that outside of domestic use, well, even including domestic use, the private sector, including agriculture, is the largest consumer of water. And so if we're going to be able to solve our water crises, the private sector, as a water consumer, has to figure out how to bring down its water consumption and its overall water footprint. There are a number of corporations, and that's the focus of one of my chapters, as you mentioned. There are a growing number of corporations which have water stewardship programs where they are purposefully trying to conserve water, and then they're trying to offset the water that they're actually using. I think the jury is still out on how successful that particular effort is, both because it's a new sector, so there are a lot of corporations that have just started to focus on this particular issue. Frequently, those water stewardship programs are not in the line operations, right? And it's not something that reports directly up to the CEO. Instead, it might report to the general counsel or to the marketing group or some group that makes you question whether or not it's really that serious. And second of all, because a lot of the programs look really good on paper, but then when you sort of dive deeper, you start having questions about various elements of it. So I'm not sure how far that corporate water stewardship program is going. What I will say, though, is that the private sector, and here I, again, don't want to draw too much of a distinction with the public sector, but with the private sector, you confront them with a challenge, and they will solve that challenge. So if you tell them they have to conserve, they will find out a way to conserve. If you tell them that we're going to have future droughts and that's going to make it more challenging to find the water they need, they will find a way to help you find some more water. And as you know from reading the book, one of my favorite examples is a farmer out in the San Joaquin Valley that one day saw storm water running down the side of his property and thought, well, what if I just flooded my field? Would it hurt my crops? And if I flooded my field, maybe that could replenish the groundwater aquifer. And so he tried it out. And what he found was it didn't have an impact on his crop. He grew permanent crops like various fruit trees as well as grapevines. It didn't hurt his crops, and it gave rise to a new area of agricultural managed aquifer recharge. And as with everything, there are side effects that you have to worry about and you have to regulate. But it's that type of innovation that gives me hope that we can actually solve our water challenges in the future.
Hear, hear. I mean, that example alone has had an impact by inspiring many similar projects, including the groundwater basin that we're part of, trying to flood some of the vineyards that are in Rancho Cucamonga, for instance. They have an active application I just heard about this week. So, that those ideas get around, right? So that's one of the great opportunities. Well, this is, as my thousands of listeners can tell, this is an incredible and a very inspiring book, and they should all go out and buy it. This is a wonderful book to have on your water shelf. What I wanted to ask you is, when our listeners buy your book, where would you like it to be placed on the water shelf? Which books would you like it next to? Not just water books, but other books. But are there specific books that you think, pair well with yours, that kind of belong to, with a liquid asset, that are in dialogue with it, reinforcing its themes or even challenging its arguments? I was just kind of curious if you see your book in dialogue with other books out there.
That's a fascinating question. Because I hadn't really thought about that, and I tend to organize my books more by color.
Yeah,
shelf.
Right. And size, right?
So let me answer that question. So there's actually a wonderful book that was written, I think maybe about a decade ago, on new water technologies and the opportunity of solving water through technologies, called Let There Be Water, which is a story of how Israel confronted its water issues. So Let There Be Water, I think, would definitely go next to that, in that they're both books looking at ways in which we can learn new lessons to solve our water crises. It also, I think, would probably go next to the books that Robert Glennon, who's a law professor at the University of Arizona, has written on the various water challenges that we face. And those are eminently readable books. And again, they just show the depth of the problems that we need to confront today. There is I remember correctly, a book that engineering professor at Cal wrote called Water 4.0,
Yes.
right? Which again is talking about how we can actually use innovation to solve some of the water problems we face. It's those books that I would put next to it, because all of those books identify the problem, but they do something in addition to that, which is they suggest, I think, realistic, workable solutions. And that's what we want. In the academic world, a lot of my colleagues spend a lot of time talking about all the problems that are out there, and that gets depressing after a while. What we need are what the solutions are, and that's what I hope my book helps to contribute.
Well, it very much does. And Dr. Sedlak, who you were just referring to with Water 4.0, he's your immediate predecessor on the podcast. Just posted an interview with him for his his recent book that I would certainly say pairs well with yours, Water for All, Solutions for the Global Water Crisis. And it's just a wonderful book, and it was a great pleasure to talk with him. An equal great pleasure speaking with you. My last question I just wanted to ask is just, now that the book's out there, right? It's out there. It exists. It's published, being talked about. What's your sense of how it's been received, and how can we get it into more hands out there? Is there I'm just kind of curious what you're hearing back from folks about the book.
So the book so far has been very well received. I appreciated your review of the book, which I thought was an excellent summary and critique of the book that talked about both what you liked and the issues that you wish I had spent some additional time on. But it's received a lot of reviews, and all of those reviews have been very favorable so far. So that's the most immediate feedback an author gets, is by reading the reviews. It is also getting a lot of play at various water-related conferences around the United States, which is really important to me, because ultimately, with a book like this, who I want to reach are the people who, like you, are out there actually managing the water, and so I think it's beginning to get out there in a very helpful fashion. I would love to see it continue to do that. And so if anyone's planning on holding a conference at any time soon, well, please let me know. I'd be happy to come and talk about some of the themes in the book.
Wonderful. You heard it here. He is open and available to come to your conference. I would strongly recommend it. It is one of those unique books that fills, as you were saying, it fills that gap in our conversation, our ongoing conversation about major water issues, and it provides a tremendous, not just overview, but also perspective on what we can do moving forward. I really deeply appreciate it on behalf of all water practitioners out there. And I would strongly recommend, and do recommend to all of them, that they grab a copy, read it, and better understand the work we're all collectively doing. Thank you so much, Professor Buzz Thompson, who we've been speaking with about his recently published book, Liquid Asset: How Business and Government Can Partner to Solve the Water Crisis, published by Stanford University Press in 2024, this year. And it is available wherever you find books. Thank you so much, Buzz, for being on the Water Shelf podcast.
Justin, it has been exceptionally fun to be on the podcast. You talk to my wife, and she will tell you that there's nothing I enjoy more than talking about water. And so to be able to spend this time with you delving into these important issues has been a delight.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Water Shelf. For water book news and reviews and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit the Watershelf website at mavensnotebook.com/watershelf. Maven's Notebook is the place to stay up to date on California water news and information. Subscribe to weekly or daily emails at mavensnotebook.com. Finally, please support authors by filling your water shelf with their amazing books. Buy them at your local bookseller and let me know what you think. Until next time, thank you for listening and happy water reading.